Hey guys, my name is Alex and I'm a tutor here at Chegg Tutors. And today I'm going to talk to you about psychological realism in literature. So, in order to talk about psychological realism and its more general category, realism, I need to talk about the movement of Romanticism, which realism emerged out of. So, Romanticism was a movement in literature and the arts and humanities and history that arose in the early 19th century and lasted to about the mid 19th century. So this is 1800s to about 1850. And Romanticism itself was a reaction to the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, the Industrial Revolution, and with the increased mechanization and urbanization that the Industrial Revolution brought. So, Romanticism was a reaction against rationalism and it preferred emotion and intuition over rational empirical thought. So, some of the authors and poets that are very well established as part of the canon of Romanticism are Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and both of those, along with Washington Irving, had a lot of aspects of the supernatural in their writings. A lot of Gothic literature, which was very prominent in the early 19th century, could be considered a subsect of Romanticism, as well as the poetry of William Wordsworth and early Walt Whitman poems. A lot of the echoes of Romanticism can be felt in the Transcendentalist movement of around 1830s, 1840s, which you see with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So Romanticism, again, it valued emotion and intuition over rationalism. Um, like I said, with Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley and Washington Irving, it can have aspects of the supernatural. Um, and yeah, so it just really valued emotion. Um, and so a reaction to that was the literary movement of realism. So realism wanted to react kind of against the idealism and the positivism of romanticism, lots of isms. And realism arose out of, again, increased industrialization and the Civil War and all of the emotional and psychological trauma that the Civil War inflicted on the United States, and as well as rising literacy rates. So, with these rising literacy rates, mostly among lower and middle class citizens, you began to see a higher demand of lower and middle class citizens demanding literature that reflected their lives. So, a lot of the literature of Romanticism didn't talk about the plights of poverty or didn't talk about what it meant to be living in the slums or any of kind of these daily problems that a lot of people experienced during this time of the Industrial Revolution. So realism was an attempt to kind of speak to those experiences. And it sought to depict life how it truly was. So this is daily life mostly, so it talks about kind of the mundane, but it turns this into the drama of everyday life. So this movement started in Europe, namely in France, and then it kind of exploded there, and then it was brought to the United States by a writer named William Dean Howells. So he was the first writer to bring realism to the United States, and he did mostly through his short stories, which he published in The Atlantic. Um, Other authors associated with realism are Mark Twain, who wrote Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And those can be categorized as realism because Mark Twain focused a lot on regionalism or different regions of the United States. So most of his stories take place in the South, and they include characters with the Southern dialect, and all of his works try to encapsulate the life and the folk stories and the different myths and religions of those in the South. And this can also be seen as a reaction to the great westward expansion that happened during the mid 19th century. So, with this westward expansion and with this kind of industrialization and kind of just with the industrial revolution, everything became standardized. So a lot of people felt anxieties that local color, local flavor would be lost. So writers like Mark Twain tried to capture this kind of local color through their writing to preserve this. Um, Other authors like Stephen Crane, who wrote The Red Badge of Courage, which is about the Civil War, were very prominent realist figures. The Red Badge of Courage told pretty much the nitty gritty and the emotional trauma that and physical trauma that went with the Civil War. And then also John Steinbeck, who came a little bit later in the early 20th century, but again tried to depict the lives as accurately as possible without kind of the romantic and stylistic flair of the Romantics, to speak true to the lives of those um, who were experiencing these kind of daily troubles of living in America, whether it be in the Dust Bowl or experience World War I. So psychological realism is a subset of kind of this truth-seeking realist literary movement. But the way that psychological realist authors went about this truth-seeking was to probe the mind of their characters. So this is also evident of the trend in the late 19th century of psychology rising as an academic pursuit, especially with the influence of Freud. So Freud's method of psychoanalysis and saying basically that probing the unconscious mind and probing the motives of someone is essential to finding out like the human character. Um, so a lot of these authors they preferred motive over plot, so analyzing the interior lives of characters rather than their exterior actions. So they thought that in order to find out the truth of the human condition, you have to probe the thoughts of their characters and find out why they are acting like they are, why they're making these decisions. So a lot of authors that are associated with the psychological realism aspect of realism are William Faulkner, who in The Sound and the Fury you can see kind of these aspects of psychological realism as he is telling the story of this Southern family in post-Civil War South through their first-person perspective. And for example, in the first chapter of The Sound and the Fury, it's told through the perspective of a mentally handicapped or a mentally disabled character, and it includes all kind of the or at least William Faulkner's perception of what life might be like in the mind of this character. Other authors are Dostoevsky with like Crime and Punishment, Virginia Woolf, who's often associated with this kind of stream of consciousness, Henry James and Edith Wharton in the United States. They spoke mostly of kind of upper crust society, and through their works, they pay special attention to the kind of psychological motives of their characters and how they navigate the bourgeois society. And while I did put kind of concrete dates on these literary movements, you can see echoes throughout all of the literary movements after them. So, for example, psychological realism can be seen in the Beat movement with their attempt at kind of first thought, best thought, automatic writing, trying to portray the individual's mind as accurately as possible by just putting everything on the page, exactly how it comes. And then you can also see this in more modern work like Mark Haddon's 2003 novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog of the Nighttime, which is a first-person story that told by the narrator is a teenage boy who has some form of autism. and the whole story is through his perspective. So again, trying to uncover this experience by getting into the mind of a character and trying to show what they're thinking, how they're thinking, and what their thought process and how they perceive the world affects their actions. So, psychological realism can be felt over decades of following literary movements. So psychological realism, finding the truth of the human condition. Yep. Thank you. I'm Alex again with Chegg Tutors.